Have you ever listened to David Foster Wallace's commencement speech called "This Is Water"?
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know if that rings a bell. It's beautiful, and a phrase from that just popped into my head where he says, if you stay unconscious, you will find this constant gnawing sense of having had and lost some infinite thing, and I feel that felt that way myself for a lot of years, and I see that in a lot of the men that I work with, this sense that they are um, endlessly chasing this infinite thing that they can't quite get their arms around, and so just thinking about the spaces that you and I have been in together, and watching a lot of brothers in this work spend a lot of time, a lot of effort, that's not wasted, but it's still missing the larger picture. And I feel them, to quote Wallace, gnawing after this, infinite thing that they can't quite get their arms around. And I think Tift and McGilchrist are pointing to um, what it is that they're missing, part of what they're missing, and a way of balancing your brain, right, to your podcast title, um, that could make a meaningful difference, as opposed to reading one more book or listening to one more podcast. It has something to do with moving more into that right hemisphere, being willing to feel more of the anxiety that Tift pushes us toward. So, anyways, that's I was ruminating on that a little bit this morning, thinking about our conversation ahead of time.
So you're talking about a different way of using my brain instead of trying to come up with a different tool or some sort of solution that can change the world I live in.
Yeah, so in the Master and its Emissary, Iain McGilchrist is talking about um, the science around the left and right hemisphere of the brain, and that the left hemisphere is kind of this specialized engine for a very kind of narrow type of focus. And of course, there's activities and experiences in life that need that sort of narrow focus, and yet his critique of our larger society and life as individuals for a lot of us is that we're living our lives out of the left side of our brain, so narrowly focused on categorizing a subset of ideas,
Hmm.
right? How we can categorize the dangers in our life, the anxieties in our life, the opportunities in our life, that we're living under kind of a tyranny of that left hemisphere, as opposed to being able to settle into the more expansive right hemisphere view that allows space for ambiguity, that allows space for a certain, um, kind of non-concreteness that I think in the modern life we're very uncomfortable with,
Yeah.
and then I think for a lot of the men that at least I work with, and I don't know if you see this in your work too, James, many successful men. I mean, I work with CEOs and C-suite executives and high-powered real estate agents and attorneys, and they can absolutely crush it in those domains that have some narrowly defined wins. But then when they move into marriage or sexuality, which doesn't play by a discrete black and white playbook, they and me for many years falter, because that sort of left hemisphere thinking doesn't work in a right hemisphere way of life.
And it doesn't work specifically when dealing with people. So sometimes I call it the control brain and the relational brain, where the left would be the control and the right would be the relational. And the beauty of the right side of the brain is the right side of the brain has no problem allowing the left to operate freely when needed. The left does have a problem. And so when the left takes over, the left completely shuts the right down and says, you're not playing here. And so that's why we get stuck with, for example, having the same relationship argument over and over and over, because the left brain ignores context like history. There's that quote that if you ignore history, then you will repeat history. And that's the world of the left brain, is constantly repeating
Mm-hmm.
history. Because the left brain, it's like, well, I tried to explain this to my partner for the last 5 years, and it didn't help, and I'm going to do it again. Because today's the day, today it's going to work. That is exactly how the left brain works, because the left brain it's incapable of handling the complexity. It's incapable of understanding the complexity of another human being. It's far too complex, and like you said, it's far too ambiguous and paradoxical. and ever changing. A human being is this dynamic and agentic creature that refuses to be
Hmm.
controlled, refuses to be manipulated, refuses to give up their freedom. And the left brain doesn't know that. It literally is incapable of understanding the idea of a person fighting for their freedom, especially in the context of a marriage or a long-term relationship. So as I move into my right brain will understand immediately, of course, my wife is going to fight for her freedom. And to the extent that I pressure or try to control her, she will rebel against that pressure and control. And every single human being on the planet will do that. And so we get stuck in the cycle over and over of pressure and rebellion and pressure and rebellion, and two people stuck in a power struggle for decades. I'm sure you've seen that
Hmm.
before.
Hmm. Yeah, you describe a lot of my life and marriage up until the last couple of years. So absolutely. And I think of I know we have a shared appreciation for Bruce Tift and his book Already Free, and I think he's describing many of the phenomena that Iain McGilchrist is describing just kind of scientifically. When he's saying, look, the experience of anxiety on some level is an immature version of open mind, right? Of contact with reality. It is a beginning step into moving into a greater intimacy, right, with ourselves, our own struggles and neuroses and losing strategies, as well as then the ability to be intimate with another person, which, like you said, James, is some vast and infinite thing. To go back to David Foster Wallace's words, there's going to be a certain level of anxiety in making contact with something that you're never going to be able to fully get your arms around, and being in love with another person and trying to build an intimate relationship with them uh, couldn't be a more infinite task. And so yeah, just like you said, the left brain is just it's just not it's not equipped for that kind of work. And yet I saw in my own life, and I see in the lives of a lot of the clients that I work exactly what you described, playing out the same narrative, the same attempts at problem solving, the same protestations that my wife or partner isn't stepping in the way that I want. Here I am doing the work, quote unquote, which often means very didactic
Well,
tasks,
doing
right?
the left
I'm
brain
reading
doing
a
the left
book.
brain work. So my left brain
That's
is
right,
getting
doing the
better
left
and
brain
better
work.
and better at something it is fundamentally incapable of ever doing.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And I think of McGilchrist, he talks about how the left brain, the left brain likes the map, right?
Mm.
It wants to stay in
And
the
it's
map,
making
where
a
the
better, and
right
it's
brain
like
is better
my
prepared for
map
the
is
territory.
so good, but I'm never going outside. I'm never going to
It's so
open that
good.
door, that window, and see the real world. I'm just going to look at this map forever.
That's right. And not just am I not going to go outside, when I do go outside and I make some contact, like the blind man, feeling the
Yeah.
elephant, you end up yelling at the mountain because it's not where it's supposed to be, right? My map says you're
So
not supposed to
true.
be here, mountain,
Oh my gosh, I see that so
Um,
often. It's like, and people will say the thing that I see people say. I work with couples only, and people in my office they'll say, "Well, what? Well,
mhm.
is she just allowed to do whatever she wants to do?" And I'd be like, "Yes, yes." That is how
That's
people are. Is people are allowed to do whatever they want to do. In fact, you are also allowed to do whatever you want to do. And as you've noticed, all your efforts to move that mountain so far have not worked because the mountain is still there. Even if you moved it on your map, and on
right.
your map you're like, oh, this mountain is now over here, that map is just a map. So put away your map and let's take about 5 minutes to just look at that mountain and just appreciate that your partner does get to make all of their own choices and always will.
That's right. Well, and I think, I'll even just describe my own journey. I mean, not realizing that attempt, that left hemisphere's attempt at control, at trying to make, my perception and my desire for how things, I wanted them to be as opposed to how they actually were, I was draining my marriage and the rest of life from the juice, or the sweetness that actually makes it a beautiful thing, right? So to your point, in working with couples and saying, yeah, your wife absolutely gets to do whatever it is she's going to choose to do. She's an agent to herself, just like you are. Um, all the ways that the left brain tries to manipulate. Sometimes, in some of the circles we run in James, you talk about being a nice guy, which, it's not a nice guy. It's a manipulative guy.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
covertly controlling guy. You drain the relationship of the possibility of anything that's actually um, sweet and beautiful because you've robbed it of um, the uncertainty and the ability to actually choose and feel chosen. And so that's the sadness of this. Looking back for all the years in my own life in marriage, where in many ways I robbed it of its ability to be sweet and full and anxiety provoking, right? Those all come together. Those are one and the same. To have the possibility for both. Um, that's where the left brain struggles, and where being able to move into the right brain and make some conscious decisions that I'm going to let myself feel some of this anxiety. I'm going to let myself be present with this wider view rather than being, laser focused on my map. Um, that's where a lot of the fear and the anxiety, it's going to come. We have every reason to assume there's going to be some greater anxiety initially, but that's also where the possibility for something sweeter and richer and more connective lies.
One of the obsessions of the left brain is causality, so cause and effect. And the left brain, part of the left brain's obsession with seeing everything on it as a map is everything is simplified to everything that happens has a cause, and everything that I do has an effect. And that ties into what you're talking about, the nice guy syndrome, where if I do the things my wife wants me to do, then she will do the things that I want her to do, as if there's some cause and effect, which of course isn't true. And so the more accurate way of looking at that is my power lies in shaping how I handle myself in my relationship. And when I handle myself well in my relationship, then I have now improved the environment my wife is living in. And that makes it easier for her to also handle herself well. But that is not a causal relationship,
Yeah.
it's an environmental relationship. It's indirect. I can go plant tomatoes in my garden and I can fertilize them and water them, and they may produce fruit. But that is not a causal relationship, as I found out over the last 3 years. I did not get any tomatoes. And so that tomato plant, still has a choice, and I'm not the only
Yes.
environmental factor in that tomato plant's life. I'm just one of the factors. Now, in a marriage, I am usually, in fact, the primary environmental factor in that person's life. And so when I handle myself better in my marriage, I just made a huge improvement into my wife's environment. And the most likely outcome is that she is going to handle herself better. She's going to show up better in the marriage in response, but not as a direct effect of me handling myself better. I think it's worth saying that trying to control her is not handling myself better. So it's not the same thing.
That's right. That's right. No, and I think that is a beautiful analogy that I remind myself and I remind my clients that, yeah, it's an ecology. It's an ecosystem that you're a part of. And the number of times that I in the past, or I see a client, um, can't, so they're able to get maybe out of their left hemisphere a little bit, or maybe even their left hemisphere helps them do some learning, catch a little bit of a vision of what it is they need to do, and they plant some of these seeds and they water them. But to your point, this sometimes obsessive focus on causality, um, the first little seedling starts to come up, and they're ripping it up out of the soil to say, how are the roots growing? Long before there's any hope of tomatoes, right? And so realizing that the right hemisphere's ability to navigate a certain level of ambiguity and anxiety, not that that's a comfortable thing, certainly not at first, but that the right brain, that's what McGilchrist says it's designed to do. It's able to take in a larger view. It is able to scan, let's say, 360 degrees and be able to like, for example, he talks about how our peripheral vision, that operates out of our right hemisphere, right? The left hemisphere visually is just narrowly focused on what's, pinpoint right in front of it. that right hemisphere is able to take in this larger view of your periphery visually. And I would say that's true emotionally too, right? To be able to operate in a much larger, more ambiguous space that is the ecology, in this case, let's say, of a marriage, right? That isn't going to be some sort of one-to-one correlation that the nice guy making covert contracts wants to operate in. I did the dishes, and so you're going to want to have sex with me. That's just, that doesn't work. That's not a healthy, thriving marriage. And yet, for the left brain, that makes a lot of sense. I've done the things that you said stood in the way before, so I'm doing them now. Why aren't we jumping into bed together
Let's
enthusiastically?
flesh that out a bit because that's such an interesting example. If I do the dishes and nothing else changes, then, I mean, honestly, I did just improve my wife's environment and she is more likely to treat me well. However, the example you're talking about is not that. The
Hmm.
example you're talking about is I did the dishes, which is, let's say I just moved, the overall environmental quality my wife is living in from like a 50 to a 51, okay? And while I was doing the dishes,
Right,
I
right.
was stewing in resentment and I was feeding on anxiety, and I was like, this is going to get her to do the thing I want. And so I was doing the dishes as a way to try to control her, which then dropped the relationship quality from a 51 to like a 35. And then I'm like, why didn't
That's
doing
right.
the dishes work when I just literally I just destroyed the environment she's living in? And then I'm like, why is she unhappy? Because left brain doesn't understand, like you said, the larger context, which is the way I feel about my wife matters 100 times more than whether or not I did the dishes. Like, she cares whether I do the dishes. Sure,
Yes.
she cares 100 times more. Does this person actually care about me? Does this person love me? And the left brain doesn't even know what those things mean and has no idea. It's complete mystery.
The men that I work with, you know, so often are, going back to that idea of let's just say even the visual field and the left hemisphere being just kind of very pinpoint, narrow focused, and the right hemisphere being able to take in a larger peripheral view as part of the big picture. They're in this left hemisphere so narrowly focused on their wife or their partner and everything that she's is doing wrong and not doing, the way that he wants her to do. And not realizing that so much of that starts internally and that we have an uncomfortable relationship with ourselves, in a lot of ways. And we have built up from our childhood, neurotic patterns that, Bruce Tift and Artie Free says, look, those aren't pathological in many cases, right? When we're talking about maybe the average person we're working with, whatever average means in this case. They're not pathological. They're out of date, right? As a child, it made a lot of sense that you might need to be excessively connecting, right? Maybe you had a distant parent, and it was up to you to do 90% of the work to connect with them emotionally because they were distant or unavailable, or whatever that might be. Or conversely, you might have had a smothering parent, and you needed to dial that back and only do 10% of the connecting because that's how you were able to maintain a healthy level of autonomy and freedom for yourself. And the reality is, I think in so many cases, at least with the men that I work with, I think they're so locked in that left hemisphere. There's a problem to solve, and what is the problem? It's my narrow pinpoint focus on my wife, without realizing the level of anxiety and discomfort and disease, I guess I could say, I have with my own anxiety and with myself. And so here I am angrily doing the dishes. The last time she turned me down because she said the dishes weren't done. Well, I'm going to get the dishes done. And like you said, there's nothing loving about it. The overall quality for my wife in that case is actually going to go down because she can feel the resentment. But meanwhile, the greater tragedy in my feeling is seeing this in my own past and seeing it in the lives of some of my current clients, that they don't see the discomfort with their own anxiety and their relationship with themselves, right? Which before that gets more comfortable and better sorted out, and they're able to shift in that right hemisphere and take in a bigger view, they're gonna have a really hard time, then relating with another complex, messy person, which is their, wife or partner.
It's interesting because you're talking about the way sometimes a higher desire partner will use sex to relieve discomfort, which is the least sexy thing in the world.
Hmm.
And so,
Hmm.
one of the most difficult situations I work with as couples is a large difference in sexual desire. is really one of the thorniest issues. And that requires the higher desire partner to stop using sex to relieve discomfort, which means that if I'm feeling uncomfortable, I'm feeling distress, and my go-to solution is, well, if I got to have sex, then I would feel better. There's a little bit of truth to that, but that pattern is not capable of creating a world where anyone wants to have sex with me. And so for me to become desirable, I have to be able to feel okay before I have sex, not afterwards. And that's a difficult journey, but it really is the only way. If I'm using sex to feel better, sex becomes not sexy. It becomes a caretaking act, and it's very unattractive.
Yeah, it's not. I agree 100%. Not only is it not attractive, you and I, James, have familiarity with, kind of a high demand religion space, the LDS community, or even just the larger,
Sure.
conservative
Yeah.
Christian community. We have familiarity there. And it's not uncommon in that space as well. In my case, I'm working with men only, to have a lot of conversation around unwanted pornography use, right?
Hmm.
Or unwanted masturbation. And that's driving that exact same thing, right? So you're saying that sex with your wife or your partner as a sort of anxiety management, misery mitigator, the least sexy thing in the world, and it's going to drive more separation. But also, in many cases, it fuels a certain compulsive, unwanted pornography use or masturbation use, um, because that discomfort with anxiety, with uncertainty. If my wife's resentful or unavailable sexually, then I find myself using pornography in ways that I don't want to, or masturbation in ways that I don't want to, and that then compounds, right, the intimacy in a lot of Christian couples who don't want pornography or masturbation to be part of it, and it compounds that inability to make real intimate contact with your wife or partner.
One of the things in McGilchrist that really speaks to me is the idea that only the right brain is capable of caring, and only the left brain feels anger, resentment, and frustration. And so you're talking a lot about people feeling frustrated and then taking action based on frustration. And one thing that I like to think about is whenever I feel anger, resentment, or frustration, I'm in my left brain. My left brain is dominant in that moment. And when my left brain is dominant, it's inhibiting the function in the right brain, which means it's inhibiting my ability to care about my wife. And so I think of it as I can pick one. I can allow myself, that's probably not the best way to say it. I have to choose between anger, frustration, and resentment or caring, and I can't have both at the same time. And and what it means is when I feel anger, frustration, and resentment, it means my left brain is dominant and I need to do some work to balance my brain so that my right brain can join the picture. And when my right brain joins the picture, now I'm capable of caring about my wife. And one of the interesting things that gets set up here is a cycle where my anger, frustration, resentment is often a response to the idea that my wife doesn't care about me very much. And her lack of caring is often tied to her own left brain lock. And what has to happen is that you get into this cycle where I don't care about her, it makes her frustrated. When she's frustrated, it makes it harder for her to care about me, which makes me frustrated, and down we go. The reverse cycle is one person has to reverse the cycle. One person has to make the move and say, I'm going to deal with my own frustration. My frustration is no longer going to be my partner's fault. It's now going to be my responsibility. I'm going to deal with my frustration. I'm going to accept the fact that I'm okay. And this ties in with Tift's work. I'm going to, like Tift says, could you feel this distress for 30 minutes? Could you accept the idea that you're going to feel this distress to
Yeah.
some degree for the rest of your life, and that's going to be okay? And so if I can deal with my frustration and accept the reality of my life, now I can open up a door for my right brain to come online, and suddenly I start caring more about my wife. And when I care more about my wife, that makes it easier for her to open up her right brain and start caring more about me. And you get into this virtuous cycle, which is amazing in how quickly it can improve a relationship.
You make me think about, Dr. David Schnarch talks about how in intimate relationships, um, he uses, a term. of emotional fusion. Sometimes I hear that called enmeshment, and that I think one of the cul-de-sacs that a lot of um, men's work, and I imagine couples work too, I think people get caught in, is the idea that we have a communication problem, right? If I could just use the right combination of I statements, my wife would finally get it and understand the
It's like an
thing that
incantation. If
I've
I
been
just
trying to
knew the magic
communicate on.
words, I just don't
That's
have
right.
the right
That's
incantation,
I
which
do
is
the
a very
stuff.
left-brained idea.
Oh, and I can probably dig back into notes over the years of trying to do the same thing with my wife, where I'm like, oh, I've got, I've got just the right, words, and now she's finally going to understand and show up the way that I want her to show up. And yet, Dr. Schnarch's point is, the reality is there really are no emotional secrets in something like an intimate, marriage or long-term relationship. And the reality is we don't, there's things we don't say because we know exactly how well they're going to go, at least at first. And so, to your point, James, that, you and your wife, and I think this is true for myself and a lot of people, my left brain gets locked in a certain pattern that then can fuel and reinforce my wife's left brain, narrow focus on it, and down we spiral. And that it takes someone being willing to go first and tolerate the anxiety. A way that could be done is, like you said, Bruce Tift will encourage people to say out loud to themselves, I give myself permission to feel negative emotion, right? To feel rejected, to feel undesired, to feel unworthy, whatever it might be. I give myself permission to feel unworthy on and off for the rest of my life. And at least for me, my left hemisphere, just recoils at that. Just what, I'm giving up the whole game. What are you talking about? I'm just going to learn to be at ease with the very problem I'm trying to solve. And yet, it's in shifting into that right hemisphere, which can take a larger view, that I can start to metabolize some of that anger, some of that resentment, some of that very narrow view that then gives me, and hopefully in turn, if my wife or partner chooses to respond, more options, more flexibility, more points of connection, as opposed to, like you said, my frustration fuels her resentment, or whatever the dynamic might be, and down we go. I can break those dance steps and at least create the possibility of a new pattern between us.
The way I phrase it sometimes is that my power lies in handling myself well,
Hmm.
and that the left brain it overestimates the power of words and it drastically underestimates the power of becoming a better person. So in the left brain loves language, language and tools, and the left brain's favorite
Oh.
tool is words. Oh man, it loves words so much. And like you and I are both people who have learned to speak well over the years, and if you're a person who's learned to
Hmm.
express themselves very eloquently, that's dangerous. I mean, it's awesome, but it's also dangerous because now my left brain is like, I have this tool and it's so powerful and it's going to solve all the problems. And it does solve some
Hmm.
problems sometimes, but not when those problems involve an intimate partner. Words are, every couple comes in and they say, we need help with communication. And it does seem that way, but that's only because their left brain is convinced that communication is the solution. When in reality, I mean, the communication has been going quite well, and the problem is behavior.
That's right.
So it's like you need help with behavior, but I wouldn't say that. I mean, obviously, it's just that communication is not really the solution to relationship improvement. What happens is as you start to care more about your partner, then communication naturally improves as a function of that. And as you become more courageous, a lot of communication problems boil down to I'm too scared to say what I really think, and uh, and so as I become more
Yes.
courageous, I start to say what I really think more, and that's better communication. Another communication tip that I like is take out the screw you, which works both ways. If I'm trying to say something to my wife, it's going to go over way better if I take out the screw you before I say it. And if my wife says something to me and there's this, it's like, you didn't do the dishes and screw you. I mean, that's it's a way of saying it. It's like if she's angry at me and she says something in a mean way, if I can take that message and subtract the screw you from it, and then look at the essential point of the message. One thing my therapist has said to me many times is she says, James, what was the most important part of what your wife just said? Because I'm supposed to say, well, she did it this way, and she said it incorrectly, and because it's all left brain nonsense. And the larger context is, oh, she
Yes.
wants me to care more about her, or she wants me to be less manipulative, or whatever it is, you know. And if I can just subtract all of the screw you from her message and just say, well, what is it she's saying? What's the most important part? Can I be strong enough to handle the central message that she's delivering?
In the men that I work with, um, that fascination with language uh, becomes a real stumbling block. And I say that because, as I mentioned earlier, if I dig back in my own notes, right, and it hit me when you mentioned language that I said notes, right? For the left brain loves language. It loves language, it loves written language, right? And so um, all of the times but before catching a greater vision and moving into, let's say, more of this right brain approach, it was let me sit alone and, like you said, write out the incantation that's going to help my wife finally understand and catch a vision of what's needed. And the number of men that I work with where, when I sit down with them, for a given week session, and they're now relaying, a 1, 2, 3 hour long argument, debate, conversation that they've had that's gone, late into the night, or, into the night. Um, and just, deepened the entrenchment between the two of them. The number of men who will say, I'm so upset, here, look at this text message that I sent my wife. And I try to not be rules based in the coaching I do, but there are certainly some, I think some general rules that can be really beneficial, especially for men starting this work, where I'm like, you're not doing don't try to do any emotional conversations over text message. Like, if it's an important conversation, you're not doing it in writing, you're not doing it over text
Why is
message.
that? Why
There might be a
why
place.
do you think that? What is the difference? Like what is lost in
Well,
text? What is lost that matters so much that I mean, I think I have an idea, but I'm curious what you think is so important about not having important conversations over text. What are we losing in that context?
well, I mean, I think on the face of it, you're losing. I mean, it's in your question. You're losing the context, right? So, I
Exactly.
mean, if I'm doing this at a distance, literally in black and white, I'm doing it with black and white lettering on a screen. My left brain really likes
Yeah,
black and
sure.
white, just very, polar views on things. I don't have my wife there, or the context of the life and home and family that we've built. I'm just narrowly focused,
Yeah,
probably on a screen. That's a completely different experience than perhaps being in my right hemisphere, in the presence of my embodied wife, noticing and feeling my own body, my own breath, my own tension, my own gaze.
yeah,
Um, the left brain, I don't think it really discounts those things, and doesn't realize that for an embodied, intimate, passionate relationship, the context matters, the embodiment
yeah.
matters, the environment matters. And you've been a critical friend in the past, in ways that I've needed James, in saying, look, lots of words can not only be a distraction but an impediment
Yeah.
from really communicating and really making contact with another person. And yet, for myself and a lot of the men that I work with, it's very tempting to think, one more word, another conversation, another
Yeah,
text message is going to be the incantation, like you said, and it rarely is.
yeah.
It almost never is. It's like you said, it's living differently. It's being in contact differently with yourself and then with this other person, which in many cases does not have to do with
Yeah.
words. Yeah.
One of the most powerful things I learned from McGilchrist, reading McGilchrist was such a revelation to me because uh, all of the ideas I learned from Schnarch and Tift and other writers were suddenly crystallized into this amazing framework which says that half of your brain knows how to do this and half of your brain doesn't. And guess which half has been running your life? And it's like
Right.
sometimes you read something that you're like, this is the truest thing I've ever read. And that just hit me like a ton of bricks. I'm like, oh my gosh, everything. My therapist does not talk about left or right brain. She doesn't even know who McGilchrist is. She doesn't think about these things this way. But every single thing she's ever told me to change has been a left to right shift. And I'm reading McGilchrist. I'm like, oh, my
Yes.
therapist told me to do that 6 months ago. Oh, my therapist told me to do that 8 months ago. And it's so beneficial to me to have an overall framework that explains, for a couple of reasons. First, there's no shame in it. I'm a person I really struggle with.
Right.
When I learn that I'm not measuring up in some way, it just tanks me. It crumbles me. I really don't handle that well. I'm getting better at
Hmm.
that, but historically, that has been such a horrible thing for me. The idea that I'm not doing something right has been absolutely untenable. I can't handle it. Well, okay, I'm getting there. I can handle it more now than I could before, but a couple of years ago, man,
Yeah.
I felt like I was descending in the depths of hell just because you told me that I was wrong. That sounds silly, but it was not silly to me. It was very real. And so
Yes.
this left right
No.
framework
Yeah.
has helped me step out of the idea of you're wrong or you're right to just like, you also have another part of your brain that actually does know how to care about people and does know how to look at the bigger picture, and knows how to look at yourself and your wife as you know magical creatures who are alive and embodied and agentic. And that's just, it's the way we look at each other when we fall in love. You fall in love and there's
Hmm.
no single there's no single part of this person that stands out. Nobody says, "Oh, I fell in love with my wife because of her left ear." No, that's not a thing. It's like you can't even describe why. It's just like, no, no. You're like, how could you not be in love with this person? Like this person
Yes.
in their whole, in their embodied self, the way they fit together is the most magical thing I've ever seen. That's a very right brain experience. And as the relationship matures, we tend to move out of that into the only thing I'm thinking about right now is this one thing that I want you to do differently, and all of the rest of you as a magical creature now doesn't matter to me at all. And that's just because, like you say, the left brain doesn't do context. It doesn't see the whole person. And so it's very much been my experience. I would say falling in love with my wife again has been learning to see her
Yes.
as a whole being. And she does make mistakes, and when I see her make mistakes, those mistakes become encapsulated in the idea of who she is as a whole, and they just become part of the larger picture, and it's just not that big a deal. Part of that has been, my journey in learning that I really am okay. I'm going to be okay, and that my wife's mistakes or my wife's shortcomings are not nearly as big a threat to me as, say, a parent's shortcomings many years ago, for example.
Yeah. Yeah. You rang my bell on several things there, James. So, um, to go back to what you first said. So, first of all, of course, um, we wouldn't be better off all having left hemisphere lobotomies, right? So for all the kind of dumping we're doing on the left hemisphere, it solves it. It serves an important purpose. And so, to its credit, you talked about how reading, McGilchrist for the first time felt revelatory. That was on some level a left hemisphere activity. It's a pretty academic book, and it was giving you some, very scientific knowledge about how your brain works. And so, cheers to the left hemisphere, to be able to focus on a
Yeah.
on a difficult book and take in that information that then your right hemisphere was able to use to say, "Oh, I see the bigger picture now, and how, so many of the things your therapist or other authors that you've read were trying to teach me." And one of the things that McGilchrist says is that, you know, this was very surprising to me the first time that I read it, is that it appears from the scientific data that evolutionarily we are actually moving in a direction where the connection between our right and left hemisphere, the corpus callosum, is actually there's less connection between the two hemispheres. We're actually becoming um, less symmetrical, if you will, in our brain, and that corpus callosum does have a certain. It certainly allows communication between the hemispheres, but it can also be a mechanism through which the left hemisphere inhibits the right hemisphere, right? So when you're talking about you know seeing the bigger picture coming together, kind of crystallizing. Oh, this is why. This is the brain science behind why my therapist was encouraging me to try X or Y. Kudos to our left hemisphere for helping make that happen. And at the same time, understanding that that magic that you're describing, that falling in love again with your wife, it is only possible when we move from that left hemisphere to the right hemisphere. And that's a willingness to go from being what I think the left hemisphere wants to be, which is, a big problem solver on a small board. And it's a willingness to move as a right hemisphere as a smaller figure in a much larger world that we don't control. And yet that's where all the magic is, right? So I think the left hemisphere in a lot of ways is a court magician who's saying, I can do magic when I really can't. I can turn lead into gold, but I really can't. It's going to be sleight of hand. Whereas when we move into that right hemisphere of the brain, real magic is possible, right? And we discover that relationships that have felt like lead can turn into gold because we allowed ourselves on some level to be smaller, while at the same time, like you said, realizing that we have an inherent safety, that as children we felt unsafe, and we had reason to feel unsafe because we were profoundly vulnerable emotionally and physically as children. But now as an adult, like you said, your wife is not your parent. You are not dependent on her emotionally or physically, and yet for myself and for a lot of the clients that I work with, we're still relating to our wife, our intimate partner, as if the outcome of this relationship is a survival level event, to quote Bruce Tift. And it keeps us unable to move into this larger, more expansive space that includes, the anxiety, the realization that my wife is a separate person I can't control. But it also allows us to move into that ecology that we were discussing earlier, where beautiful new things can grow, and falling in love becomes possible again because you're not trying to control or manipulate or engineer an environment that was never in your control to start with, let alone another human soul that's not under your control or power.
I think the perceived size of the problem is critical here because left brain is a focused problem solver. And if I allow my perception of a problem to, if I allow this idea to come into my mind that this problem is so big that's the only thing that matters, then my left brain is going to focus on solving that and it's going to neglect everything else in my life. And this is my experience for so long where like 80% of my brain cycles were spent spinning in resentment about my wife to absolutely no positive
Yes.
effect whatsoever. But this is this idea that my brain was so convinced that this was, like you say, a survival problem. This was the thing that matters. Like, I'm going to die if this doesn't change. And so, left brain is like, well, then, this is the fire I have to build. This is the house I have to construct. This is the elk that I have to hunt and kill to feed my family, right? Because the left brain is about
Yes.
solving these survival critical problems. It's about how do I manipulate the environment so that I can survive? That's what the left brain sees everything like. And I like how you described it as a big problem solver on a small board, because the left brain, it's always a small board because it only ever looks at a tiny piece of reality. So I'm
Hmm.
building this house, I'm making this fire, I'm crafting this tool, I'm killing this animal. That's your left brain at work, and it doesn't pay attention to the rest of the world. The other one of these most striking things that McGilchrist tells these stories of people with right brain injuries or with severed brains, split brain patients, and it talks about how the
Hmm.
left brain relates to every living thing as if it was not living. And so these people would describe, because the left
Mm-hmm.
brain, is in charge of perceiving the right half of the body, and so these split brain patients, for example, would describe the right half of their body as being made of wood or metal, which is just mind blowing. But that is the way my left brain
Mm-hmm.
also perceives my wife, as some sort of machine. And we all know that machines
Yes.
can be controlled. And so, like, if I'm fixing my car or I'm fixing my dishwasher, that is a great task for the left brain. Left brain is like, oh, let me move this wire here. Let me clean out this pump. Let me replace this motor
That's
oil,
right.
and everything will be better. Human beings, especially, do not work that way at all. And so any attempt I make at direct manipulation of my wife will always backfire. And the left brain just doesn't see it that way. It's in I've come to, I guess, have a little bit of compassion for my left brain. It's designed to do very specific things and do them well, and it works really well as long as it doesn't get involved in my marriage.
Yeah. Well, and that idea of the left, the left side of the brain being a narrow, focused problem solver. Um, I think of in just having recently gone through Already Free by Bruce Tift. Um, he talks about his work over decades with thousands of couples. Um, and I'm curious if this is true in your practice, James, that 99%, 99% of couples come in, and one of their chief complaints or concerns is that we're not close enough. We need to be closer. And he says, in many cases, at least couples he's working with in the United States, an initial problem they have is there's actually not enough
Mm-hmm.
separateness
Mm-hmm.
in the couple. A little bit back to this idea of like, an ecology within a relationship. There has to be a healthy balance between closeness and separateness. And Tift makes this just really striking point where it was one of those moments where I was like, oh my gosh, I feel my journey and my struggles just made so much sense. Is that if as individuals and as couples, we don't consciously choose a certain level of healthy separation, in the men's work, it's very common for guys to start with the book like No More Mr. Nice Guy. And one of the things that's empowering by, Dr. Glover is this idea of, well, we need to reclaim, some time for ourselves. We've gotten so wrapped up in marriage and family, like, yeah, I'm going to go join the local sports team, or I'm going to go, take up woodworking or whatever. And there's a lot of value in that, but I think one of the larger ideas that just doesn't get described in that book, but Tift captures, and I think it's a description of this left hemisphere narrow problem solver, is that if if we don't, in a healthy, conscious, explicit way, create separateness to be healthy individuals, we unconsciously engineer separateness in the relationship. And Tiff's argument is that becomes the fuel that fuels a lot of these never-ending conflicts in marriage. That I don't think I realized for all these years I was the high desire partner, sexually and for discussing the relationship. And well, I'm the one who's trying to make the relationship work. I'm doing 90% of the work, and yet I didn't realize in not taking care of myself and carving out a certain healthy separate space for myself, I was unconsciously uh, engineering the very separation that I claimed I didn't want, as opposed to saying, hey, I'm going to create some space. I'm going to set some boundaries around things that matter for me. I would encourage you to do the same, wife and partner. And we're actually going to have a healthier ecology as opposed to, again, getting very much into my left hemisphere and this idea. What's the problem? We're not close enough, right? We're not having sex enough. We're not having novel sex enough. We're not talking about relationships enough. Let's have another 3 hour conversation about relationships, where in a lot of cases it's the counterintuitive thing, especially to our left hemisphere. We actually need to have a little bit more separateness. And that's what's actually going to help drive some of the intimacy, the passion, and the ability to connect as healthy
Mm-hmm.
individuals as opposed to um, tired, stressed out, kind of unconscious souls who don't know how to relate to each other in a intimate, passionate way.
Yeah, I often tell couples you need more conflict, not less, which is very close to what you're saying, which
Yeah.
is more separateness. Uh,
Yeah. Hmm.
can you step into more conflict? And the key to conflict is I'm going to reveal to you what's in my mind, even though I know it's not going to be pleasant for you, and I'm going to do that in a way that makes it very clear that I'm on your side at the same time. And so, Steve, I'm revealing my mind to you, and I'm saying something. I'm not really, but theoretically, I'm saying something to you that you probably won't like. But I have done my work to realize that I'm still on your side and I still care about you as I reveal this thing to you. Whereas what normally happens, talking about unconscious separation, is I reveal what I really think about you, and I'm so angry while I do it that I'm also kind of pounding you into the ground while I tell you this thing. which of course has the opposite of the intended effect. And so fruitful conflict is I'm going to be honest with you, I'm going to reveal myself to you, I'm going to be a separate person, and I'm going to be okay when you disagree. It's a hard thing to learn how to do.
It is a very difficult thing to do, and I think, um, when I really started my individual journey in a new way, and I think I wouldn't have had the words then, but I think it was, getting enough of a crisis, right, a crucible moment, to use Dr. Schnarch's language, that forced me, at least for a moment, for a glimpse out of a left hemisphere into a right hemisphere, to take in the larger scope and on some level be able to take myself in, right? I'd been so narrowly focused on my wife and who she was or wasn't, that I wasn't looking at my own behavior and realizing, I remember the words going through my head, I'm a profoundly dishonest person, right? Not in the form of, I don't cheat my employer, I don't
Yeah,
cheat on my taxes, I don't cheat on my wife,
yeah.
not that sort of dishonesty, but when my relationship with my wife is of a survival level concern, right? I am in fight or flight on some level on a chronic basis over the course of, 15 years at that point. um, of course, I'm going to trade honesty for security. Like Bruce Tift talks about it, as a child learning to relate to the imperfect parents that we all had. We all had imperfect parents who were doing their best. We're imperfect parents now, and our kids are going to have to work on a certain level of therapy, where we fell short. Imperfect parents that we had. It was a survival level event as a child to be able to stay in close connection and get the care that we needed from our parents. That's not the case now in our marriages, and yet we continue to trade away our integrity for a perceived sense of security. And that security is actually not that secure or that pleasant, but it's familiar. And so, yeah, to your point, James, when I'm willing in a relationship to share my honest thoughts, that, like we talked earlier, I have every reason to know how well that's probably going to go at first, and that's why I haven't said it. But when I'm willing to share my honest thoughts that I've hopefully wrestled with and made them as, integrity based and love based as possible, but I know it's going to raise the anxiety for me and for my partner. I'm now stepping into, I would argue, that right hemisphere where there's going to be more anxiety, but there's going to be more possibilities, and I am allowing myself to be part of the picture, by revealing my honest mind and my honest heart, as opposed to just being so narrowly focused on my wife and what she is or isn't doing. It is a scary move after, for many of us, coming to this work at midlife or later. So it's been decades, right, of playing out these patterns, likely from childhood. I have a lot of respect, and I think of Dr. Schnarch often opining to the therapists that he would be training or talking to, that we need to have a lot more compassion, right, for people who are trying to do this work, because it does feel like a survival level shift to be honest in a way that you've really never been honest with yourself or with a partner before. Because to the nervous system, that really does feel like a survival level event, that you're about to cut off the branch that you've been sitting on. The irony is that's going to actually, move you into some freedom and a space for new possibilities. But it is going to feel like a terrifying drop at first. There's going to be a pit in your stomach. Your heart's going to race. You're going to lose sleep. And Bruce Tift often says, and who would choose to do that? Like, you have to be, you have to be, really at a moment in many cases where you're up against the wall, right? Where maybe divorce has been mentioned, right?
Mhm.
Maybe, that unwanted pornography use for a couple where that's a big deal has come to light. Maybe there's been an affair, physical or emotional. It's often those moments, you need that level of crisis to be willing to take that step off a ledge where, you're finally honest and you're unwilling to continue to trade away your integrity for this false sense of security. It's a scary thing to do, and I get why. A lot of people struggle to do it and struggle to maintain it because after decades of living out of that left narrow focused hemisphere, it's very scary to move into the openness of the right.
Ooh, I love that. Yeah, because Tift talks about the terrifying openness of life. And that is that is
Yes.
a very right-brained idea because the right brain is okay with ambiguity and it's okay with paradox and it's okay with uncertainty, and the left brain is not. And to the left brain, it really
Hmm.
reality is terrifying to the left brain. The left brain is like, nope, 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 back to the map, back
Hmm.
to the map. We're not dealing with this, the ambiguity, the complexity, and especially the agency of people that I'm in a relationship with. And so this idea that my wife can do whatever she wants whenever she wants. Sometimes I tell couples, I'm like, my wife could actually be at the Mercedes dealership right now buying a new car, and there's nothing I could do about it. And they're like, what? I'm like,
That's right.
well, am I right or wrong? And they're like, you're right. I'm like, no, she wouldn't do that, but that's just because she chooses not to. It's her choice. It's not my choice. And so this idea
That's
that I
right.
can somehow make my wife not buy a new car is it's just fundamentally not true. To the left brain, however, it is definitely true. There is an incantation, there is a prompt, there is something I can do or say that
Yes.
will finally get you to fall in
Yes.
line after 25 years, right? And so it just never
Yes.
learns. It just never gives up. Never, never give up, never surrender. That's the left brain's motto. Is I will find a way to control you if it takes my dying breath. And so that's kind of how it operates. Never works though.
Yes. Well, and you made me think of, one of the most just beautiful, succinct teachings, practices that I feel like we've been given. It comes from Dr. Jennifer Finlayson-Fife, and it's easy to overlook in its simplicity, and yet I think it's worth the cost of admission for a lot of her work, which is if you don't know what else to do, right? If somebody's listening to this and they're like, yeah, I do want to improve my life, or I do want to have a healthier, happier, more intimate marriage, and I've been playing out these patterns again and again. I don't know what else to do. She will often say, if nothing else, just don't do the wrong thing. And again, to a left brain, I would argue that feels deeply unsatisfying, right? Because you're not telling me what to do and you're not guaranteeing some outcome. But I think in many ways that is a shortcut, at least to short circuit the left brain, even if you're not able to fully move into the right brain, to say, look, I don't know how else to show up better in my marriage or in this conversation or, whatever it might be. But I know that if I'm condescending, if I move into the space of 1,000 words or text messaging, whatever losing strategy where I go, oh my gosh, I keep dying on this level of the video game again and again and again. I've got to stop trying to, stop doing that thing. That can be a beautiful gift that you can give to yourself and to your marriage to let yourself move into the ambiguity of, I don't know what else to do, but I know I shouldn't do that,
Mm.
and that's not very sexy to the left brain. It's not a do. It's not the So one of our friends, Jane, often will say it's not the Konami code. Up down. Right left A B, and it's going to work
It's a
out.
great left brain idea.
And yet, it's a beautiful gift. It's a beautiful gift you can give yourself in your marriage to say, I'm going to move out of the certainty of my left brain into the ambiguity of my right brain because that's where all the new possibilities lie. And the reality is, if I already had the answer, I would have implemented it by now. So let me at least not keep, putting my finger into the power socket and let there be space for something new to happen. But it requires a certain level of faith, just kind of writ large, that insight is going to come, right? And the goodness can come when we leave space for it to grow. But it's very hard for the left brain to be able to step back and do that.
Hmm.
But that's a great practice or exercise that, in many cases, as my wife and I were building a second marriage together, which we're still in the process of. But that there were many days where that was the refrain in my head of just don't do the wrong thing. I don't know how to show up better. I don't know how to make her show up better, which of course I can't do. But I can at least not do the wrong thing that I've done for 15 years, and I know how well it's going to go if I try it for the 100th time.
Yeah, sometimes I phrase that as feel more, do less. Because so much of our ties in with Tiff, but so much of the unhelpful things I do is just me trying to run away from discomfort. So can I just feel that discomfort and then do less? And that ties into the idea of the place to start is to stop doing what you have been doing because it isn't working. Another way of saying it is that the process of relationship improvement is more about becoming a better person and not doing a certain thing. And so when couples come to me and ask for tools or techniques, I might say you're barking up the wrong tree because improving your relationship is about becoming a better partner. That is the entire thing. That's the whole thing. Is I'm going to become a more caring person. I'm going to become a more brave person. I'm going to show up in my relationship in a better way because I have become a better person because my brain is more capable of caring and more capable of courage. And that's what improves relationships. And tools and techniques don't really have very much to do with it. It's about becoming.
Yeah, as we were talking there, James, I was thinking about what you cited earlier from McGilchrist about, an individual who might have a right brain injury or having the brain separated, and the left brain describing the right part of the body as being wood or metal, mechanistic, right? Unhuman, not a person, right? And so when you're talking about um, the whole story here, right, of what a person might be doing in therapy to improve their relationship or in coaching to improve their relationship, um, is becoming a better person. That starts with just letting yourself be a person, right? And not wood or metal or a machine. And that's where, to go back to one of the earlier ideas of the number of men that I see who become, and this was me too, for a time, so narrowly focused on the work, quote unquote. Which again, there's value there. We should read, we should learn, we should listen to smart people, but it can become very mechanistic of reading more pages, listening to more minutes of a podcast, as opposed to being a person who, a person sometimes doesn't have the answers. A person often doesn't have the answers. A person feels fear. A person feels anxiety. A person feels connection and disconnection. A person is always changing and moving and growing. I mean, there's, I think, beautiful insights there from Buddhism, right? That it's impermanent. We're always changing, and until we let ourselves be a person who sometimes doesn't have the answers, who sometimes is selfish and needs to be called on that selfishness, or whatever it might be, um, we don't have the possibility of, let alone being a better person, right? And being a more whole or holistic person. And so, um, again, I mean, that idea from Dr. Finlayson-Fife of, if you don't know what else to do, just don't do the wrong thing. I think one of the beauties in that is it's a profoundly humanizing step to say, I don't know, right? I don't know. And again, I think when we live out of the left side of our brain, if this is a survival level event, I don't know is not an option, right? If the tiger's coming at me and I don't know how to defend, ward it off or kill it, that is a problem, right? If my family's starving and, like you said, I don't know how to hunt and kill the elk, that is a problem. I don't know is not an option, but it doesn't allow us to be a person or to be in relationship with another person where this isn't a survival level event. This is an intimate relationship that, like you said, needs time. It needs an ecology. It needs the humanness between the two of us. And something like saying, I don't know what else to do, but I'm not going to do the wrong thing. I'm not going to do the mechanistic thing. I'm not going to do the unconscious thing, is a profoundly humanizing step. And it's not satisfying to that left hemisphere, but it can be a beautiful step into the right, to let yourself be a person who doesn't know. And as a person who has built, and again, this is back to the idea of many of the men, at least that I work with, they're very successful men. How were they successful? Well, it certainly was by not knowing, right? It was by knowing. It was by having a plan, having a solution, knowing how to execute. And it doesn't surprise me then when, for them and for myself, for many years, we discovered that the very counterintuitive step of saying, I don't know, was in many ways the doorway to new possibilities, and we couldn't find it for so long because it's not how we found success in the rest of our life, professionally and otherwise.
It is very different. There's a lot more room for left brain operation in most careers than there is in a marriage. So like my career, I was
Hmm.
25 years in the military, and the military is quite forgiving to people who operate in their left brains. Being a therapist is not,
Hmm.
as you might imagine. So to the extent that
Yep.
I allow my
Yes.
left brain to take over when I'm working with a client, then I will absolutely fail as a therapist. And that has happened many times. And change happens in the right brain. Growth happens in the right brain. Learning how to care happens in the right brain. Learning how to love happens in the right brain. And
Hmm.
that has been, I I did a thing last month. I had this shelf in my office. My therapy office is just full of psychology books, and I took them all out of my office and I replaced them with poetry books. And it was like this symbolic
Yes.
act of rebellion against my left brain. I was like, not today, Satan, not today. Like, so now
That's
I start every
it.
session by, I say, I have chosen a poem for you. And we sit down and we read a poem, and people just stare at me with blank eyes, like, what are you doing? Like, why are you reading me a poem? And
Yes.
the reason is because it helps me settle into my right brain. And it helps me settle into
Hmm.
caring and to thinking about the bigger picture, into seeing both of you as living beings and magical creatures and not as machines to be manipulated. So it's critical. I
Yes.
learned that from a man named Steve Gilligan. Steve Gilligan is a very old
Oh,
psychologist. He's in his 80s, and I've worked with him before, and he starts everything he does. He starts with a poem, and the whole idea is like
beautiful.
this is going to help us settle down and drift into our right brains because poetry to the left brain is complete nonsense. It's like, what are you even talking about? That
Yes.
makes no sense. And poetry to the right brain is like, oh, that's beautiful. That it, poetry is using the left brain's tool, which is words, to describe reality, which is full of paradox
Hmm.
and complexity and metaphor. And that's why poetry is so powerful. So,
Well, and can I say with that, James, one thing that maybe to now just zoom out big picture a little bit, because I think we've talked a lot about individuals and couples, and I think we're living in pretty exceptional times, James, where um, I believe we're finding right now, and I think in a matter of months, not years or decades, um, as a larger population, we're going to realize that we have a perfect left brain at our fingertips in the form of AI and chatbots. And that's going to be profoundly destabilizing, I think, to a lot of people. And I say this as somebody who has found a lot of success in life as a left brain person, that unlike, an industrial revolution that maybe took jobs from lower skilled blue collar workers. There's a lot of importance there, and well, I'm not disrespecting that work. Um, but I think we're going to find with AI that's coming, it's going to be oncologists, right, and their ability to read MRI scans, right. There's going to be a number of very of jobs that require a lot of training, a lot of technical skill that we're going to discover these machines can, or in very short order, will be able to do very quickly. And and I think that we're going to find that's a profoundly destabilizing experience for us as humanity. And so, where do we go? And I think, of course, that's an open question, and we're going to have to see how that all navigates. But back to McGilchrist, I think it's in our right hemisphere, right? It's going to be in what makes us most profoundly human,
mm,
and not mechanistic and not machines. It's going to be our ability to authentically and deeply relate to one another. And I do worry, and I'm grateful for the work that you're doing, James, with couples. Um, I think we're going to discover there's a large number of people who are going to opt out of the work of human to human connections
mm.
because AI will be so emotionally potentially provocative, and will be able to answer seemingly so many of our questions. Who's going to want to go out and relate to a messy human who's going to be disappointing at times, is going to be selfish at times, is going to be unpredictable, and yet I believe I'm profoundly of the side that we would lose some great and infinite thing, right? To go back to David Foster Wallace, if we lose our ability to connect and create intimate human relationships. And I think that's what's gotten us to where we are as humans, is our ability to connect and care and cooperate and imagine together. And as machines increasingly take over the left hemisphere, probably to our benefit, and there'll be beautiful things that come from that and beautiful solutions. What a great opportunity and a great call to better develop our ability to live out of our right hemisphere and connect in a deep and profound way that makes us so uniquely human.
I love that. I think we should actually end there. That's such a beautiful thought.
Sure.
So, Steve
Sure.
Thatcher, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It was such a pleasure to talk to you. And where can people find you?
SteveThatcherCoaching.com. That leads to my Facebook page, and there's an opportunity for people to sign up for a Zoom conversation if they want to talk a little bit more.
Perfect.
Yeah.
It was such a pleasure to have you, and I can't wait to talk to you again.